Hello, and thank you for joining us, everybody. This is an incredibly important meeting, and it's uh, it's an important moment where lots of organizations that have been working on human rights together are working and setting up SANID as a way of campaigning together for the cause of UAE detainees. So it's an opportunity for us all to reflect on the condition of individuals in the UAE who are being denied the most basic rights, but it's also an important opportunity for all of us to ask ourselves the question of what we can do to support them in the various ways that we are able to. My name is Aziz Mahmoud, and I'm from the International Campaign for Freedom in the UAE. And I would like to take this opportunity to introduce some of the speakers that we'll have today. Each one of the speakers will be speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes, at which point there will be an opportunity later on for questions from our listeners and from the audience. And it is both a moment that is difficult because we are appreciating that we are in the absurd position of having individuals who have served their terms and are still not being released, but it's also an important moment to draw attention as we look forward to various opportunities and moments where it will be very important to see what is happening to detainees in the UAE as an expression of the need for more basic rights and guarantees in the UAE. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Hamid Al-Shamsi, the Executive Director of the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre, who will be giving us a short introduction and an overview of the situation of detainees in the UAE. Thank you, Hamid.
Yes, thank you, Aziz, for this introduction. Today, I would like to talk about an issue that has been forgotten by the world: the situation of prisoners of conscience in the United Arab Emirates. This issue may need hours to talk about, as we are talking about dozens of prisoners of conscience and many disgusting violations of human rights in the UAE. But I will try to summarize the issue in these minutes. During the past decade, the UAE Authority has detained and imprisoned several prominent human rights defenders, journalists, and political activists. These individuals have been subjected to torture and
Hi
other
everyone.
form of ill treatment and denied access to medical care. They have been convicted of crimes such as insulting the state or defaming the ruler under the country's strict laws on speech and expression. For over 10 years, the UAE Authority have been unjustly detaining more than 60 Emiratis who were arrested in 2012 and sentenced them to between 7 and 15 years in prison during a trial in 2013. That trial failed to meet the international minimum standard of a fair trial. The list of 60 detainees include lawyers, judges, academics, and human rights activists, such as Dr. Sultan Al-Qasimi and Dr. Mohammed Al-Mansouri. It also includes Dr. Mohammed Al-Rakan, one of the leading human rights advocates, and also it includes the Dean of the Graduate School at the UAE University, Dr. Hadif Al-Awais. Since their arrest in 2012, this group of prisoners, which became known as UAE 94 Group, have been subjected to serious violations, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and ill treatment, while some of their family members continue to be harassed and persecuted. This year, the detainees have now spent almost 11 years behind bars, while some of them were denied family visits or communication with their families for years. Some of their families have been subjected to and continue to be subjected to reprisals. In addition to the UAE 94 detainees, the UAE government has unjustly imprisoned several other prominent human rights defenders and journalists. One of the most prominent cases is that of Ahmed Mansour, who was arrested in 2017 and sentenced to 10 years in prison on charges of insulting the UAE leaders and publishing false information that harms the country's reputation. Mansour is known for his advocacy on issues such as freedom of expression. He has been subjected to solitary confinement and denied access to medical care. There are also political activists such as Dr. Nasser bin Ghaith, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison on charges of committing hostile act against a foreign state. And this charge was because of a tweet that he wrote back in 2015 criticizing Abdel Fattah al-Sisi regime. While I'm talking to you right now, more than three-quarters of these prisoners have been completed their prison sentences, yet they are still in arbitrary detention. The UAE authority refuses to release them for allegedly posing a terrorist threat, using vague laws that allow their indefinite detention in violation of Article 9 of International Covenant on civil and political rights and other international covenants. Some of these detainees completed their sentences years. Some of these detainees completed their sentences years ago, such as Abdullah Al-Hulu, who is still in prison despite his sentence ending 6 years ago, and also the engineer Abdul Wahid Al-Badi, who has completed his sentence 5 years ago and yet still in prison. Before I conclude, I would like to remind you of the case of Alia Abdel Noor, who died in prison because of inadequate health treatment. Alia died in prison despite the appeal of human rights organizations to the UAE authority to release her so she may die among her family. I brought Alia Abdel Noor case to show you that the UAE authority is willing to keep prisoners in prison till they die. Many of the current prisoners of conscience are suffering from health issues and their ages are in the mid 70s. I am afraid that one day another case of Ali Abdel Noor we will face, another death of, we will face or we will hear about another death of a prisoner of conscience. So it is time for the international community to stand up and demand justice for these prisoners in the UAE. We cannot remain silent while individuals are punished for exercising their fundamental human rights. We must call on the UAE authorities to release these individuals and ensure their rights are respected and protected. We are here to tell these prisoners of conscience that we stand with you. We will not forget you. And I invite all human rights organizations and the international community to join our call for their release. Thank you. We cannot hear you, Aziz.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Sorry about that. I think that I think it's a perfect moment for us to introduce our second speaker, who's got a message for us via video, Jinan Al-Marzoughi, who's the daughter of Abdul Salam Mohammed Darwish Al-Marzoughi, who is a detainee. And in particular, it's about highlighting the human aspect of what detention means and how actually there is a certain type of vindictiveness in some of the detentions whereby the families of individuals who are detained are also made to suffer as well. I think that should be something that should probably surprise and shock those of our listeners who are unaware of this. So if we put on the video, that would be good.
Hi everyone, I want to start by expressing how pleased I am to witness SANID campaign come to life. I have full faith that this campaign will be a significant step in our journey of supporting prisoners of conscience, and we will hopefully witness positive changes regarding human rights in the UAE. Today I want to discuss the human rights situation from the perspective of a daughter of a detainee. I want to speak for all families of detainees in dissent because I believe that the suffering they endure and the violations they're subjected to is no less than that of those in prison. It just looks different. Unfortunately, when we take a look at the authorities' practices in the UAE, we find that it lacks all means of tolerance and humanity, contrary to what they would claim, and that it's filled with discrimination, harassment, and oppression, especially when it comes to families and relatives of prisoners of conscience. Or even dissents abroad. The intolerance and inhumane practices can be endless. The UAE authorities do not stop at repressing and detaining activists for many years and imposing harsh penalties on them after unfair trials. They also extended their oppression to their families as further means to seek revenge and to suppress and silence dissenting voices. The harm that families and relatives of detainees are enduring includes discrimination, continuous surveillance, intermittent questioning, restrictions on education, medical care, scholarships, and employment, banning from traveling, and finally revoking citizenships or refusing to renew IDs and passports. It is estimated that the government has revoked the citizenship of at least 19 relatives of detainees and dissents, barred 22 relatives from renewing their identity documents, banned more than 30 relatives from traveling, and restricted access to jobs and higher educations for many more. And these numbers are always subject to increase. I will use my family as an example of how families and relatives of detainees are targeted in the UAE. Since the year my father was arrested, we have been subjected to arbitrary and indiscriminate harassment, violating our basic rights to citizenship, work, education, freedom of speech, movement, and privacy by state security apparatus. I want to start with the harshest method of punishment, which is revoking citizenships. I think it's the harshest because there isn't much difference between someone who's in prison and living without any legal document. This means that you are automatically deprived from all your rights. In addition, you are unable to appeal this decision because it has no legal basis and you're not provided with any legal decree. For example, we were informed that our citizenship was revoked through a phone call, and we were not provided with any explanation or legal basis to this decision, leaving my family and I stateless and depriving us of basic national and human rights. The UAE uses citizenship revocation as a tool to punish activists and critics of the government. In instances in which the government has revoked a man's citizenship, like in the case of my father, the UAE's nationality law allows for the subsequent revocation of the citizenship of his wife and children, meaning us. While the law requires publishing the decree withdrawing citizenship in the official newspapers, we never managed to obtain a copy of the decree, or we never saw the decision published in the official newspapers, which makes it difficult to appeal the decision. Furthermore, this decision affects every aspect of the victims' lives. You can't get university scholarship or a driving license or apply for a job, or even much more because you don't have any valid identification. In other cases, families of detainees or dissents are denied access to the same basic rights and services despite their citizenship not being revoked because state security is not granting them approval to renew their passports and their national ID cards. Many families of detainees are unable to renew their IDs and other documents, leaving them effectively trapped in the UAE and struggling to get basic rights and services. Like the consequences of revoking citizenship, authorities are restricting the education, employment, access to healthcare, and other basic rights of victims of these arbitrary practices. Another tool used to target relatives of detainees who usually are not even engaged in any form of political or social activism is banning them from traveling. My sister, who's currently stateless in the UAE, is banned from traveling. She's not getting her basic rights in the UAE and is trapped as she is unable to leave the country to seek another citizenship. Many other people are suffering from this injustice, including elders, children, cousins, and other relatives. Usually what happens is that family members don't get notified of the travel ban, and instead they find out about that at the airport when they had already prepared to leave the country. In addition, the travel bans are informed verbally only, and when someone asks the airport officials who issued the order, they would simply tell them that the order came from the state security apparatus. In addition, none of those affected have had the chance to appeal or challenge these decisions because, again, the travel bans are not court ordered. They're basically arbitrary decisions made by state security apparatus. Now, let's say you're one of the lucky people who can renew and use your passport and you are not banned from traveling. You're still required to complete a state security clearance process to get a job, whether in a public sector or a private sector, or to obtain a trade license. Now, again, if you are a detainee's relative, your access to employment and business opportunities is restrictive and you'll probably end up getting a lower paying private sector job to sustain yourself and your family. Furthermore, you're required to bear the intermittent, intrusive questioning at the hands of state security officials. I still remember the first time I got summoned. I was only 17 years old and the interrogation was very exhausting. I was asked about every detail in my life and the lives of people I know. Since I've moved to the US, occasionally they will call relatives and interrogate them for hours. They try to gather as much information about, my family and I, and then and they would also send messages through these relatives for us to stop advocating and advocating and communicating with human rights agencies. The measures taken against relatives of dissidents appear arbitrary and unjustified. None of these restrictions, that I've mentioned has a clear legal basis, and none of the targeted relatives, including myself and my family, have been able to get an official government or judicial document mandating the action, nor have we been able to appeal because we don't have these legal documents that prove these decisions. The UAE authorities not only punishes those who peacefully dissent, but harasses and abuses even those related to them. Through SANID's campaign, we're looking to shed light not only on prisoners of conscience, but also the suffering that their families and relatives are enduring. We're aiming that our voices get to those who continue to associate themselves with a government that collectively punishes innocent citizens. Thank you all for your time and thank you for listening.
Thank you from Janan. I think it's important at this stage to bring in Khalid Ibrahim, the Executive Director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, to speak to us about the way that arbitrary detention and secret prisons also play an important part in the methodology by which detainees are deprived of their rights. So bring in Khalid at this stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And a special thank to Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center and our colleague Hamid Al-Shamsi for his efforts. They are always in the front line, supporting our work and supporting the work of others. That is the human rights spirit. We have to work together. We have to support each other. When we talk about UAE, we have to know that the last vendor was my colleague, Ahmed Mansour, who used to provide the international community with the latest and accurate accounts of all violations committed by authorities in this country. He was, as you know, arrested, detained on the 20th of March 2017. He's still in solitary confinement, facing a lot of ill treatment. And many reports talked about what he faced, torture and a trial that lacked the minimum standards of a fair trial and due process. In actual fact, that is what happened to all members of UAE 94. Many reports focus on torture and ill treatment and secret detention centers that are run by the state security apparatus. We released a report about torture in 2015. In 2021, we released another report about torture. And our human rights partners, they did the same. So this is not something that is happening remotely. It is a systematic behavior by authorities, and always we have some reports coming to us, even now, from some migrant workers who suddenly their family reported their disappearances. They are taking them to secret detention centers, torturing them. They don't know why they are in prison. They don't know for how long they will stay behind bars. The other issue, and that is very important for us to know, that in recent years, UAE has a policy to try to get some international positions within some institutions in order to show that they are really capable of playing a role in the international scene. And unfortunately, a country that is abusing human rights on a daily basis managed to get the presidency of the Interpol, the law enforcement agency of the world. Maybe that is a success for the authorities, but on the other hand, due to the work of civil society organizations, Lyon, the city of Lyon, the mayor of Lyon, they celebrated the work of Ahmed Mansour, despite the fact that the headquarters of Interpol is in Lyon and the Major General Ahmed Nasser al-Risi is there. They decided to give the citizenship of this beautiful city to Ahmed Mansour. And that is a recognition to his work as a courageous human rights defender. And also it is really a reward for our collective work. It is not just this. The other stories about really the fact that we don't have a local remedy in United Arab Emirates, where we go to address all these massive violations that happen on daily basis. There's no any local remedy, but then we have to think about the use of the concept of international jurisdiction. And that is what we did in cooperation with the human rights lawyer, William Borden in Paris. And I can tell you that hopefully the criminal proceedings against Major General Ahmed Nasser al-Risi will be started soon. We have given testimonies to prove that he is part of the team that tortured our colleague Ahmed Mansour. You know, he joined the police force in 1980. He became the general inspector and still of the Minister of Interior. So there is no doubt about his involvement. The other issue that I want to highlight here is the fact that as we speak now, there are 56 prisoners of conscience, including 2 women. They are still in prison despite the fact that they served their full sentence. Now, in UAE, usually, even if you are a criminal, you will get an amnesty after serving 2/3 of your sentence. The amnesty is given by the head of the state. And we know for sure that in all these amnesties, even not a single prisoner of conscience was really released. All of them, after serving their full sentence, kept in al-Munasaha centers or the counseling centers. And what are these centers? They are just a wing in the same prison. No advice, no any support. They moved just the prisoner of conscience from a wing for example, in a Razin prison to another wing using the terrorism law and the national counseling centers law in order to keep them in a prison. And they are even ready to create some fabricated charges against some of them in order to keep them in prison. I am very sad about all that. It is not, they are not numbers. They are humans. They have families. They have friends. And for me, it is very hard to talk about them because I met and I worked with some of them. I just have to mention Dr. Mohammed al-Rukun, such a personality. He's a respected academic who has contributed a lot to the field of constitutional institution and constitutional law, an international lawyer. We have to celebrate the life of Mohammed Rukun and all his colleagues. Dr. Muhammad Rukun shouldn't be in prison. And the same will be said about Dr. Nasser bin Ghait and Dr. Muhammad Mansouri and Abdussalam Muhammad Darwish and Ahmed Mansour and all of them. I have to mention Al-Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Razak Al-Siddiq, all the names. There is no time to mention all the names, all of them. They are law-abiding citizens. They shouldn't be in prison. We have to celebrate their achievements and their contribution to the progress of the Emiratis society in all their rich work. Now, what is the solution? Is there a way that we could address all that? We, civil society organizations, we have to find new avenues. We have to work together. Very honestly, we have to work together. There are a lot of ways in which we could end this unconditional support given to UAE and other oppressive governments in our region by US and UK. We have to talk to the Western governments. We have always to find a way to highlight all these violations. I think with our collective work, with our various actions, including this really very, very powerful campaign that initiated by our colleague in the Emiratis Detainees Advocacy Center, the SANID, or Support Prisoners of Conscience in the UAE. I think this is a step forward, and there are other actions that could be taken in order to ensure the release of all our colleagues in UAE and to ensure that the government of UAE will respect the civil and human rights of its citizens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that incredibly powerful contribution that actually ended with a tone of optimism about what the work that SANID could do together by bringing together the different talents and energies of the different groups involved. I'd like to take this moment to move on to Ines Usman from the MENA Rights Group, who will speak to us a bit about the laws used in order to maintain the detentions and the kind of the stripping away of rights, in particular the state security law. So thank you, Ines. Welcome, Ines.
Thank you, Aziz. Thank you so much. And yes, as was previously mentioned, I think the SANID campaign is really welcome and timely. I do believe that those abuses have been taking place for a very, very long time. We've been talking about the UAE 94. This case is far from being new, but UAE have benefited from let's say less denunciation of such abuses taking place, or at least less knowledge and awareness on these abuses. And it's important that there is light shed on those, on the cases. I'm sure we'll go back to that, but the Universal Periodic Review of the UAE is going to be held this year. COP28 is also going to be held in Dubai. So these will also bring about opportunities to actually shed light on the situation of prisoners of conscience. And I also really want to commend Hamad and Jinan, who are both Emiratis living in exile. And I think, their work and their efforts, to try and shed light on the situation of some of their family members, friends, is really remarkable. So I also want to thank them for all their commitment and efforts that we're happy to try and support in any way we can. So yes, indeed, back to the state security apparatus. So as was mentioned previously, the state security apparatus is really at the core of a lot, most of the human rights abuses taking place that we've mentioned before, and they have really played a prominent role in cracking down on any form of peaceful dissent. So I will explain, but very briefly, kind of the legal framework surrounding the state security apparatus and why it's problematic. So first of all, I will have to say that actually the SSA law has never been made public, and everything I will say is actually based on a copy of a version from 2003 that was obtained and published by the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center. But so far, the law has not been made public by the authorities. So there are a number of issues with the state security apparatus law. So it essentially allows the SSA to operate without any institutional, judicial, or financial oversight. The SSA reports directly and solely to the president of the UAE. So there is no form of accountability, judicial oversight whatsoever. And as the SSA is also tasked with protecting state security, they're also allowed to conduct, exercise any activity to achieve such goals. The state security apparatus has very broad powers. So, for example, they can gather and analyze information, including on any so-called political activity that seeks to prejudice the state's safety, national unity, or governance system. They can also, and again, I quote, like, monitor social phenomena, whatever that means, and take any measures they see fit to try to limit that social phenomena. The president of the SSA can also place suspects in custody for up to 3 months before bringing these individuals before a judge, which obviously is in violation of international standards. And last but not least, the decisions of the SSA president are binding for all security apparatuses and other relevant bodies. So it essentially means that anything the state security does or say kind of supersedes all the other institutions. So, for example, they can go in a prison, establish an office there, overlook certain detainees. They can even establish themselves in government offices, even embassies and consulates. So they can really oversee all the different forms of, like, governmental offices, security institutions, and really have the kind of last say and overarching power over those. But so obviously the state security apparatus law is extremely problematic, but as was mentioned before, these, like, abuses such as enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, including beyond the completion of prison sentences, does not are perpetrated by state security forces, but they don't happen in a vacuum. And the state security apparatus has also been able to rely on many various different legislations to actually crack down on peaceful dissent. And this legislation is among some of the most repressive, actually, in the Middle East and North Africa region. Just to, again, like, be very brief, but first of all, the counterterrorism law. So the state security is tasked with investigating crimes prescribed under this law. The problem, however, is that the definition of terrorism is extremely broad and vague. It does not necessarily include violent acts. And essentially, any form of peaceful dissent is actually considered an act of terrorism. And as was mentioned before, the law also provides for the establishment of so-called munasaha rehabilitation centers, which are supposedly established for to enlighten and reform persons convicted of terrorist offenses and that are deemed to, like, that are considered to pose a so-called terrorist threat. The penal code also includes a number of highly restrictive provisions that also fall under the jurisdiction of the state security apparatus. But just to name a few, something like insulting the president of the UAE can get you in prison for anywhere from 15 to 25 years in prison. Same goes for anyone who insults, mocks, harms the reputation, prestige of the state, its flag, emblem, symbols, etc. And last but not least, the cybercrime law, which was adopted in 2012, so right after the beginning of the Arab Spring, also contains several provisions dealing with national security issues, and therefore, again, falling under the competence of the state security. So again, just to name one example, so unlawful content is actually defined as content that intends to harm the state's national security or sovereignty, or decreases public confidence in state authorities, whatever that means. And yeah, so I mean, we can really tell that these provisions are extremely broad and vague. And in addition to this, anyone under the cybercrime law, anyone who shares with any organization or association documents, reports, or data that may harm the state's interest, governmental agencies' reputation, prestige, or standing also faces prison. So essentially, anyone on the ground in the UAE who would be, I don't know, sharing some information with NGOs or with the United Nations, would be at risk and could face arrest by the state security and prosecution later on. That's that for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ines, for that comprehensive kind of overview of the legal structures and legal systems. Now I think we'll take a turn to a more personal insight from Matthew Hedges, who was a detainee himself in the UAE, and he'll speak a bit on why he thinks that a campaign like this is particularly important, given his experiences. Thank you, Matthew.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for everyone for tuning in, and for SANID for putting this campaign together at quite a fundamental time. I don't want to step on Julia's toes, and I don't want to repeat anything that has been previously said, but I think what's evident from everything that's been spoken about so far is the idea of control. Everything is maximized for the state, for the state security, for their control over individuals, for their control over society, and there's a cycle of re-victimization that continues to occur, where individuals, where their families, where anyone who could be seen as a potential threat, which is in effect anyone who is not part of, in this case, state security, can have their lives destroyed. They could have, everything changes within a second, and there's no recourse. There's no ability for an individual to be able to go beyond this. And so what we're here speaking today primarily is about Emirati society and Emirati citizens. As Janan said, she's been made stateless, as a fundamental human right. She then has no basis to be able to support her own life, her own her family, but there's a communal punishment for alleged crimes that her father has been subject to. It's the idea that no one can be beyond the reach of the state, and that they will continuously be punished for this. And this is why it is such an important campaign. It is such an important thing to do, because for Emiratis, they have no other option. There's no voice for them, and that's why, sadly, the community of exiles, of people who are trying to discuss this issue is growing. It's growing because there is a increased scope, there is an increased aggression and attack by the state against individuals. And it's taking this this agency away from people. But Julia will, I suppose, now explain how and why it's such a crucial time to be able to elevate these arguments and to be able to highlight these issues. If people continue to be, subject to arbitrary detention years after their sentences were completed, what does this actually mean about the the fundamentals of the legal system itself? What does it mean for the people who are going through this? It fundamentally is an uneven playing field that continuously changes in the state's favor. But I just wanted to give a small point because it's good to have some questions as well. But I want to thank everyone for turning up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. And you've in a way introduced Julia, who's the head of advocacy at place, who will speak a bit and answer to some of those questions about what's going on here. Why isn't there a larger, why isn't there a great amount of energy that is being offered by the wider international community towards the release of UAE detainees, and what can we do to change that? So thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Aziz, and also thanks to the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center for initiating the SANID campaign. And I think that's really a great opportunity for different actors to come together and work together on trying to increase the pressures and get ultimately to reform the human rights situation in the UAE and to help release prisoners of conscience. I will try to speak a little bit about the role of the international community, but also to kind of place what's happening in the UAE in a bit of a regional context where maybe we can also find solution to some of the problems. The UAE is often referred to or considered as a beacon of stability in the region, with places like Dubai being a big economic hub, and over the last years, Abu Dhabi having been developed as a cultural center with prestigious secondary brands of museums and universities. And they've also been very successful in attracting tourism and international events such as the World Tolerance Summit, the Hay Festival, the Expo, as was mentioned, the upcoming COP28. So the UAE have been really successful in kind of presenting a shiny image for themselves, and have also very early on cracked down on any peaceful dissent and really managed to fully silence any critical civil society, which then really only left the state narrative, to be spread. This is, I think, where we're really talking about a difficult context in the UAE, because they have been successful in sharing that kind of image and creating, as I said, also sort of economic incentives for a lot of foreign businesses to operate tax-free or semi-tax-free, and that's obviously also in the interest of a lot of states to have, their companies go in the UAE. I don't know, I mean, if we look at now sort of the regional context, the UAE is not an isolated case. We see a lot of shared malpractices or patterns all throughout the region. Many of the colleagues have mentioned them. They include the anti-terrorism and cybercrime law to crack down on any peaceful dissent. They include the use of the revocation of nationality for dissidents and their families, the imposition of travel bans, also as like measures of reprisals, and the detention of prisoners of conscience in terrorism rehabilitation centers beyond the expiry of their actual sentence. And I think what they also all use is a narrative of reform and progress in a way. On the one hand, to like weaken social movements, but also to try to appease international allies, while they're failing to really implement any kind of sufficient reform, or definitely not a human rights reform. Now, what has been done by the international community over the past years, I think we need to kind of differentiate a little bit who we're talking about in the international community. If we look at multilateral actors such as the UN or the EU, we actually do see that there were actions taken. We've seen quite a few resolutions of the European Parliament on the general situation, on the case of Ahmed Mansour, on the UAE's involvement in Yemen. We're also seeing regular communication by the UN special procedures on rights abuses by the UAE authorities. These complaints include or mention migrant workers, women's rights, prisoners of conscience, flawed legislation, and many others. But obviously that's not been enough. I mean, what we would really like to see, I think, is more pressure by international political stakeholders or businesses, because they have a lot of leverage and they have not really used that leverage sufficiently for us to be able to see those human rights defenders released from prison or really structural human rights reform taking place in the UAE. But what can be done? I think we need to continue using existing mechanisms on the multilateral level, be that the UN treaty bodies, so that the treaties that the UAE has ratified, they're being reviewed every few years by the committees of these treaties to see if there's any implementation, and there's pressure that can be exerted through this mechanism, and they're concluding observations that are usually quite strong. And we've seen this during the last review by the UN Committee on Torture last summer, that voiced, I think, a lot of harsh criticism on the practice of torture in the UAE and made very strong recommendations of what would need to change to address these concerns, or continue sort of scrutiny on the level of the European Parliament. As I said, there have been resolutions. There need to be mechanisms to really follow up on the resolutions and the demands in these resolutions. On the EU level, there's also the EU human rights dialogue with the UAE, which has not proven to be the most successful mechanism, but it is available. Sort of civil society kind of can try and utilize that. And I think what's been quite useful, at least in the Saudi context, but I think in other contexts as well, is holding the authorities to their own promises. So one could do that also within the UN system, like with the Universal Periodic Review that is going to happen again in May of this year, whereby states make recommendations to the state under review as to how they could improve their human rights record. Then the state accepts or rejects these recommendations. And those that the UAE has accepted should also be implemented. So if we look at the last review, for example, they have accepted some recommendations to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, including by positively responding to visit requests by special procedures mandate holders. They've also said that they will take further steps to ensure freedom of expression and association. I mean, these are kind of, the problem lies often in the fact that these are vague recommendations, and it's easy to accept vague recommendations because you can't really follow up on the progress made. And I think overall one has to say that also during the last UPR, the UAE didn't make a lot of important promises. So I would hope that during the coming review, that in the lead up to it, I know many of the partner organizations have submitted reports and are in the stage of doing lobbying with UN member states to ensure that these recommendations are strong, and that hopefully the UAE accepts as many as possible and then can be held to account for these promises made. Other things would also be, for example, the pledges, the voluntary pledges the UAE makes when it applies for membership on the Human Rights Council. There it has, for example, during its last election, pledged, I mean, I can kind of quote or read that. It says, with regard to cooperation with the Human Rights Council mechanisms, the United Arab Emirates attaches great importance to the work of the human rights mechanisms by submitting its periodic reports to various treaty bodies and pursuing the implementation of its recommendations. The UAE also supports the vital role of the special procedures and reiterates its eagerness to continue to cooperate with them as it has done in the past. So if you make a pledge like this, then you should be open to allowing international monitors into the country, to allow special procedures mandate holders that are critical to the human rights situation, such as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders or torture or counterterrorism. There are plenty. And also allowing international NGO representatives to monitor the situation on the ground, which is sort of an impossibility today and over the past years. While the UN has been, I would say, quite active on the UAE, obviously more needs to be done and pressure needs to be exerted by the international community. And that, I think, really includes a multitude of stakeholders. Like, this won't be done by just one of the many speaking out or changing their behavior, but this needs to be a big and exerted effort by civil society, by supportive media, by pressure from political stakeholders, by business stakeholders. But also, I mean, as I said, governments, unfortunately, are often all too complicit and have their own interests in mind, having sort of a partner in the region that they can count on, that is considerably stable in a region that isn't very stable. But I mean, there are also other ways to shed light on the situation and to increase international pressure on the authorities. And I think that can be done not just by international governments, but it can be done by international members of parliaments, even opposition members of parliaments, by highlighting individual cases to their UAE counterparts, by offering parliamentary protection. I mean, there are programs such as in the German parliament for human rights defenders at risk, whereby a member of parliament can really take up an individual case and advocate for them. I think that's something we should look into also for UAE prisoners of conscience. And then there's ways for international civil society cooperation, highlighting individual cases and also suggesting people for awards, for example, or honorary citizenships, like we've seen from Ahmed Mansour in the city of Lyon. And I think we need to kind of campaign more and mobilize the general public. I find it really strange that, given the extent of the human rights abuses in the UAE, it is still like kind of a paradise for some people in terms of holiday. Like, why would you go on holiday to a country that is so repressive? And that, yeah, I mean, where practices like torture are institutionalized. Is this really, I mean, it's also a moral question, and it's a question that concerns a lot of people. So I think we need to, in our respective countries, also mobilize the general public to understand the severity of the situation and to help us put pressure on Western governments to increase the pressure on the UAE authorities. And I think regional cooperation is very important because there are so many similarities when it comes to the abuses in the region, that I think we can only really successfully address them if we work together. I mean, there is sports washing, there is greenwashing. All of these things are being done by different governments in the region, and I think we civil society actors need to come together and address them jointly, try to build as many bridges as we can, and therefore I think it's also a really great moment to start the SANID campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. So what I'm going to do is, and if we can keep answers to about 60 seconds, if that's possible, I'll have a quick question for each of you, and then I think later on we'll come back and maybe we can do a few closing points, but closing remarks. But I'll start with Ines, if that's okay. Could you tell us a bit more about what the UPR is and why it's important, and why it could be important in this context?
Thank you. Yeah, the Universal Periodic Review is a review of all UN member states' human rights record by other UN member states. So it does have a bit of limits because it's obviously a peer review. Julia was mentioning some of the work of, for example, the UN treaty bodies. So those are independent experts. So it's, yeah, I would say it's quite different. But it's obviously important because it's an opportunity to highlight the gross human rights abuses taking place in the UAE. I think many of us are also planning to, let's say, do some targeted advocacy with like-minded UN member states ahead of the review to also make sure that they are briefed on, like, you know, key concerns from civil society and possible recommendations to make to the UAE. And as Julia was highlighting, the interest of this mechanism is that the state kind of goes home with certain recommendations that they are accepting to implement. And I do think that there is a little bit perhaps missing, you know, from our end in terms of actually following up on those recommendations and whether they're effectively implemented. So it will be an opportunity to bring up some of those issues.
Thank you very much. Matthew, as much as you're comfortable, could you tell us a bit more about the reality of detention in the UAE and your experience of potentially the arbitrary nature of it as well?
So my detention was very was from the state security perspective very, very light. I think Hamed would maybe be able to give a more accurate picture. I was held in solitary confinement for 7 months. You are everything is taken away from you, and everything. I mean, also your ability to think. They were very careful, in my perspective, to not physically harm me, although they threatened to send me to Yemen till I think it was Belhaf. They said that I'd never see the light of day again. But from my time there, the short time it was, like, other people were, you could hear them being beaten. There was blood on the floor. And the other stories, when I was moved to an open prison for a day, I heard of stories of a prisoner group that were forced to stand for a week, and so their limbs were, all the blood had gone to their feet, had gone to their legs, and it was extremely painful for them, but it wasn't something that was directly inflicted. But we do obviously know of physical torture also occurring, but the physical element was also inflicted upon me through like forced medication, which then made me very, very sick and ill. But for other people, and for Emiratis especially, who have no other, there is no support for them, they are simply thrown away. The conditions are about as bad as you can, are as bad as you can imagine. Know of one person that was, he was raped in prison, and he was given HIV from the person that raped him. So it's, if this is the, if that's the level, then anything can happen, really.
Thank you. That was very incredibly disturbing. Hamid, What message would you give to those who say that, well, the UAE is a great place to go on holiday. It's got really good tourism and really, there's really great buildings to see and things like that. What are they missing that's quite important? I mean, I know we've spoken about it a lot tonight, but if you could almost summarize it in 60 seconds.
Yeah, before I answer the question, I need to elaborate a little about what Matthew has just said. I mean, it is very disturbing experience. I know that Matthew, had very disturbing experience, but I need to highlight that every prisoner of conscience has gone through the same situations. So every prisoner of conscience has been detained in secret prisons, and they has been detained in solitary confinement, and they has been subjected to torture. And when I'm talking about torture here, I'm talking about like beating. They like the solitary confinement, very cold weather. So for almost 6 months, like the detainees in the case UAE 94, they had been in secret prisons for 6 months from July 2012 until March 2000. So it is more than 6 months. It is now around 9 months until March 2013. This is, unfortunately, it is not only the problem that this is happening, the problem that it became normal. So when keeping people in such a presence, in such facility, they consider it as normal. They only say, okay, why you oppose the government? Why you tweet it in a way that the government doesn't like? This is your responsibility. So they are, instead of blaming the government, they blaming the innocent. I mean, they blaming the victim of a tweeting. I mean, exercising normal human rights action, tweeting in a normal way, criticizing an Egyptian government, for example. The people now will start blaming you instead of blaming the government of torturing you. And when we talk about state security cases, we talk about tweets. So tweet considered to be a state security case. And I'm not really sure how can you imagine that a tweet is a state security threat. A tweet about something not related to the UAE, about Egypt. So Nasser bin Ghaith, when he criticized Abdel Fattah al-Sisi regime, he was, subjected to a state security case. And unfortunately, that case was only a 1-degree trial. So these kind of things happening. Ahmed al-Zaabi was tortured. Ahmed al-Zaabi was beaten in the prison, and this was documented in the paper of the trial. I mean, this is what was brought to the judge in the front of the judge, and the judge did not comment on this, unfortunately. Going back to your answers, to your questions, I do not want to take a lot of your time, but unfortunately, when people come to the UAE and visit the UAE, they see the widest street and the longest building, and they are happy. I can understand that, but unfortunately, they are supporting the government against its people, because when they go there, they just, because we are the people from UAE, so we suffer more than the other people who come to visit. So when they come to visit the UAE, they come to just enjoy the beaches. I understand that. I understand that, because when they spend their money, they come to visit and enjoy. But they need to know the reality. I mean, the reality is not only the longest building or the widest street or the happiest people. I mean, this is not a true slogan, but this is what they are trying to promote. There are people in prisons beyond their sentence. Nobody knows when they're going to be allowed to be released. Their families cannot travel. They have, their families cannot even, like many has revoked their citizenship, so their children cannot go to the hospital, for example, because they do not have a valid identity. So there is a problem in the UAE. It is not only about the longest and the widest. Also it is about people being in prisons for years, and only God knows when they're going to be released. So I really thank you for having this panel, and I really hoping to hear some good news in the future times very soon. Thank you, Aziz.
Thank you very much. And if we can do the last two questions quickly, I do want to, Khalid, you said something very powerful about how, you're naming the prisoners, and you really said, these are not people who should be in prison at all. And I think for people who don't know much about the cases, they'll be surprised to hear that, like Hamid mentioned, people are in prison for tweets that have nothing to do with the country, or people are in prison for petitions, or people are in prison for really these sorts of things. What would your message be to people who do similar things, people who tweet, people who sign petitions, people who are lawyers and human rights defenders? What would your message be to them around the world at the thought of potentially finding yourself in prison for a decade for something like that?
Thank you. I want to talk to people who are taking freedom for granted. They are really working in a very healthy environment. They have protection by the state, and they are really exercising all their rights. They have to look at what is happening in our countries. They have to address the unconditional support given to oppressive governments by their own governments. They need to talk to their representatives in the parliament and in other institutions. Without them putting pressure on their governments, it will be very difficult for us to have a change. I believe strongly that the change is coming. It will take time. We have to put a lot of efforts, and those who have freedom in their countries, they need to support us by engaging with us, by protesting against all these violations. And I just have to add to that something about really Western citizens. Imagine that you ask one of them, okay, we are giving you everything, medical care, money, just don't intervene in politics. So what will be their answer? What will be their answer? So the same thing is happening in our countries, unfortunately. We are giving you money. Don't talk about the way we run this country. Really, this is almost a direct violation to the rights of citizens. We know for sure that no creativity in any society without respecting the civil and the human rights of all citizens. I conclude by saying, really, it is up to us to make this change happen in UAE and in other countries in our region. We have to find new ways. We have to find new approaches to address the massive violations in our countries, whether UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Syria, Yemen. We are the people. We are from the region. Of course, we have to work with the international community, with the international organizations, but the fact that we are in the field, we know what is the best approach to address these violations, and I think it is time for us to work, all of us, to work on new ways to force a peaceful change in our countries. Thank you.
And thank you. And thank you for that. Julia, you mentioned, you spoke a great deal about the different ways in which people perceive the UAE outside of the UAE. What would your message be to someone who's listening to us today who doesn't know much about what's happening, that might be quite shocked and surprised by lots of things they've heard today, and that's asking themselves, okay, but what can I do?
Thank you. I think there is quite a lot of information out there on the human rights reality and on the ground in the UAE. So I would invite them to try and research this a little bit. All the organizations that are participating here today have written a lot about the violations. And yeah, I mean, maybe I second what Khalid said as well. Like people, yeah, that are living in countries under governments where they have their rights and freedoms respected should get on board with our campaign and should join forces to try and raise awareness about the human rights situation in the UAE, about the fate of the prisoners of conscience, and jointly address this with their governments, with the people next to them, with, you know, at every opportunity they can join us, be it for protests in person, petitions to their governments, and just raising awareness and adding their names to our campaign. Sorry, Aziz, you're on mute again.
No, Mike was muted there. No, thank you so much for the panelists tonight. And I think what the panelists have really done an incredible job at is showing us the many different ways in which the popular image that we see of the UAE from outside the UAE, of it being, you know, a place where influencers and architecture and trade and so on, that actually underneath all of that are these torture chambers. And I think it's particularly important for the UAE authorities to really reassess what they're doing, because, you know, a lot of these relationships the UAE is asking for, be they trade relationships, tourism relationships, relationships with people in culture and the arts and other places, they rely on trust. And if, as people from outside the UAE, people become more and more aware of the fact that citizens of the UAE are being tortured all of the time, that detention is so arbitrary, that there is very little or next to no civil society, I think it gives very little space for trust. And I think that, you know, this is not cost-free for the UAE authorities. They need to appreciate that people are not going to be able to trust them as trade partners, as places they can go to. The more they find out that not only do they arbitrarily detain their own citizens, but actually, even when the terms are finished, they don't let them out. I think that sort of knowledge makes it incredibly difficult to deal with the UAE. And I think the UAE needs to really, really, really consider whether having a security apparatus like this is actually in its interests when it carries out a proper calculation of where the best interests of the state really lie. So unless there's any final contributions, I'd like to thank all of the panelists tonight and say that this campaign is a brilliant opportunity for anyone who wants to get involved, anyone who's heard anything tonight that makes them think, you know what, I really want to make a difference. There's space, there's various different routes and various different ways of trying to help with the plight of detainees. And I think there's a real space for a real moment of empathy, that none of us would want to find ourselves in this sort of position. And therefore we have a particular incentive and human incentive to make sure that this doesn't continue any longer. So thank you very much to the listeners, and thank you so much to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.